Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for all the views and all the support recently on this channel. We do have a fairly eclectic mix of material that I've been providing for you guys. We just uploaded a podcast with my friend Dreama, and we're also going to be continuing with the heavy metal videos. In this video today, we are going to be exploring Lamb of God, specifically what happened to Lamb of God from Richmond, motherfucking Virginia, as Randy Bly would say. So Lamb of God is a super interesting band. I wouldn't say they're necessarily my favorite band, but they are a very, very important band throughout the history of metal and my own journey as a metalhead. Still have a video planned called My History Being a Metalhead, or How I Became a Metalhead. So just to start with, I think when we're discussing Lamb of God specifically, and I do have some visuals and some pictures that I hope to share with this video, so you're not just looking at this awkward face right here, but it's hard to really, I think if you weren't a young person when Lamb of God kind of came out, I mean, of course, you can find Lamb of God, you can find the beauty of Lamb of God at any point in time, but if you weren't a young teenager, maybe in high school or maybe even younger, maybe a little bit older, middle school, high school, early college, it's hard to really appreciate what Lamb of God was in the early period of the 2000s. Okay, and you know, Lamb of God has been around since technically under the guise of Burn the Priest. And I will be referring to some notes here because I haven't memorized all the release dates and all the dates that all the members left and all this kind of stuff. I'm not going to have my nose buried in the text, but just in case anybody's wondering, I did a lot of research just based on my own knowledge of Lamb of God, but I do want to supplement that with some of my notes just to make sure things flow in a progressive manner. That way we're not all over the board, which we probably will be anyway. But going back to what I was saying in the introductory phase was, it's hard to really appreciate or understand what Lamb of God really was, maybe if you weren't a young person. Now, similar sort of to the Nightwish story, how I found Nightwish, I came upon Lamb of God not super late, but I came to Lamb of God on the release of their third into their fourth album. So I was kind of a latecomer. I wasn't like an original, Richmond, Virginia based, original diehard supporter, right? But when I went to high school in ninth grade, I had these two friends that they actually grew up in Germany, and I still remember their names to this day. I can still consider them great friends, even though we don't talk anymore. We kind of just grew apart like people do. But I do credit my friends Dennis and Jamie, specifically Jamie was his name, for really getting me into most of the heavy metal and specifically Lamb of God for this video. Jamie, my friend Jamie at the time was basically a couple years ahead of everybody else. He knew what all the heavy, the raunchiest, nastiest, most disturbing metal that you could possibly think of. He knew it like a year or two ahead of time. When most people are listening to Metallica in eighth grade, he was listening to probably Lamb of God and Death and Morbid Angel and Suffocation. And he was like a walking encyclopedia of metal. And it was just a really cool experience to sort of go to high school and grow up with somebody like this, because if it wasn't for my friends sort of introducing me to some of this music, I may have never found it, number one, and maybe number two, probably would have been a little bit afraid to even approach it. But if you have sort of a community, I mean, that's what heavy metal is. It's a really large, unorganized community. And that's kind of what Dennis and Jamie were for me. And long story short, sort of really late high school, or really late middle school into high school, I was kind of getting into Metallica and Slayer. And by the time ninth grade hit, I was pretty much a full-blown Slayer guy, full-blown Slayer head. But and of course Slayer had this really great reputation, right? So did Metallica. But I think for me personally, it was a little harder for me to sort of let newer, up-and-coming, younger bands into my peripheral, just because I was like, okay, these, this new up and coming band, are they going to be around in 2 years or whatever? And that's kind of what Lamb of God was for me at first. And meanwhile, I was kind of dabbling in Cannibal Corpse and Morbid Angel and Suffocation, all of these really cool death metal, black metal bands, all kinds of thrash metal bands that my friends Dennis and Jamie were sort of introducing me to. But when Lamb of God came on the scene, and I don't mean when Lamb of God originally came on the scene, but when Lamb of God came on the scene for me as a noob and as a latecomer, they were a really, really profound band, and I was actually really, really afraid of Lamb of God. And I think partially that was just due to their whole weird Southern aesthetic. I took one look at their pictures, and I'm like, they all look like a bunch of hillbillies mixed with this hardcore singer dude. And when I heard his voice, I was just really, really appalled and really, really disturbed. But that's part of Lamb of God, right? And I think before I start ranting, I just kind of wanted to sort of introduce this video with the concept of how disturbing Lamb of God was to me. Now, obviously, they're not the most heaviest band in the world, but for what they do, they've stayed very, very consistent. They've stayed extremely consistent, probably way more than Metallica, probably way more than Slayer. And in order to prepare for this video, I actually basically just binge listen to their entire discography. I own a decent amount of their albums on CD. A couple of their later albums I just haven't really acquired yet. Haven't really had the time to really explore them in depth, but everything that I heard, apart from the Sacrament album, which dates all the way back to 2006, I believe. I could be wrong about that. I think Sacrament came out around 2005, 2006. Was fairly consistent, and the Sacrament album is pretty interesting in itself. We'll talk a little bit about that, but that's just sort of my little introduction to Lamb of God. Lamb of God was very scary for me at first. I was afraid to listen to them, and they were actually on tour back in 2005. I want to say it might have actually been 2006. I think it might have been after they released Sacrament. When they were on the Unholy Alliance tour with Slayer and Children of Bodom, and who else was there? It was Children of Bodom, Lamb of God, Slayer, and there was one other opening act. I forgot who it was. But if you guys were there at that tour, whether you were there for the whole time or whether you were just there for one date, I happened to catch Slayer and Lamb of God. We were actually late just as Children of Bodom was ending, and I didn't know really who Children of Bodom was, but I was starting to listen to Lamb of God, and I really came to the show to see Slayer. But Lamb of God, when I first saw Lamb of God back in 2006 on the Unholy Alliance tour, I mean, it was the most insane metal sound that I had ever heard. Now, they were kind of going through a transitional period, and before I start ranting, let's sort of start from the beginning, and we'll kind of go from there. I do just kind of want to show you guys a little live footage of Lamb of God, just to give you guys a little. I'm not going to have the sound on, just because YouTube's going to come after me and all that stuff, but this is a really, really big concert that they did at Download Festival. It looks like it's probably Europe. I could be wrong. Anyway, so Lamb of God, most people know Lamb of God as Lamb of God, but they were traditionally under the moniker of Burn the Priest, and they started way back in around 1994, maybe 95. And the original lineup that we see in this video technically was not the original lineup from the get-go. I'm going to refer to my notes here, but Lamb of God was technically formed in Richmond, Virginia in 1994 by Chris Adler, Mark Morton, John Campbell, Matt Connor. Did I get all the members there? Chris Adler, Mark Morton, John Campbell, and Matt Connor at Virginia Commonwealth University. They basically all met at the community college at Richmond, Virginia. For some reason, I didn't write Randy Bly here, but maybe he comes into the story later. So basically, they started jamming, right? And, they had no idea what they were going to become. They didn't really know what direction they were going in, but they wanted to be heavy, right? sort of Willie Adler and Chris Adler. I don't even think Willie was actually in the band at this time. They had Matt Connor. He was the second guitar player, and the other guitar player at this time when Burn the Priest was originally formed was Mark Morton, obviously. So we've basically got Chris Adler, Mark Morton, John Campbell, and Matt Connor, basically starting a band at the Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. And then eventually Mark Morton and Matt Connor sort of left to pursue school. I'm not sure how much school Mark Morton, actually pursued, but it says, according to some of the sources that I've read, Mark Morton and Matt Connor eventually left pursuing school and other projects. And then another gentleman by the name of Abe Spear then joined what was then Burn the Priest, right? So we're talking pre-2000s. This is like going all the way back to the late 90s, before Lamb of God was a thing, right? But eventually, maybe 96, 97, Burn the Priest was like an official band. They probably weren't super professional, but they were on their way to becoming Lamb of God. They were doing a lot of shows in Richmond as well as around there. They had a big following in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. For some reason, that was a really big hub for these guys. They gained an enormous following in some of those places like Philadelphia and even some other places outside of Virginia, which is really interesting. So eventually, let's see here. Let's refer to my notes just briefly. So somewhere along the line, I'm not sure who was doing vocals at this early period from 94 to 95, but at some point around 96 or 97, according to my sources, Randy Bly joined as the lead vocalist. And that's sort of what we know as Burn the Priest, right? Maybe they were Burn the Priest before that, obviously, but maybe they didn't have a vocalist, or maybe one of the guitar players was doing vocals. I'm not really sure what was taking place there. But around 1997, Mark Morton came back at some point, according to my sources, and he rejoined the band. And let's fast forward about to 1999 here. Burn the Priest recorded their first album. It was more like an EP maybe, but they recorded their first album under the moniker Burn the Priest, right? And most of you guys have probably heard Burn the Priest. Burn the Priest probably sounds as close to New American Gospel, the first Lamb of God album, as you can probably get. But it was a little more hardcore influence, maybe a slightly more grindcore, I guess you could say, but it was more just really raunchy hardcore. It was just really like heavy, sludgy hardcore, I guess you could say. So fast forwarding to 2000, Chris Adler has been playing for Burn the Priest since the beginning, to my knowledge. He's been the original drummer. But around the time of 2000, Willie Adler, which is the drummer's brother, Chris Adler, joined Burn the Priest, and they actually evolved into Lamb of God around the year roughly 2000, right? I think this video is about to end, so I don't want to have any annoying ads. So I'm going to pull up a decent picture of Lamb of God here for you guys. This is the current lineup, and we're missing Chris Adler, which should be right here. But Chris Adler left the band roughly around 2019. We'll get into that later. Lamb of God is full of drama, so, it kind of coincides with the Nightwish video. So by the time 1999, 2000 comes along, Burn the Priest has become Lamb of God, and they have a new vocalist, Randy Bly. And obviously he's not a new vocalist. He's been in the band, but there's some confusion of actually when he was in the band or whatever. But anyway, Lamb of God comes onto the scene around 2000, formerly known as Burn the Priest, right? So Lamb of God is basically just a really heavily evolved, prolonged progression of Burn the Priest. But there's a couple different reasons for they wanted to be, why they changed their name from Burn the Priest to Lamb of God. It kind of makes sense because it still sounds like a heavy metal band, but at the same time, it kind of doesn't. But Burn the Priest just kind of automatically put them in sort of a maybe a death metal gore category or something. They basically wanted to be more progressive, is from what I've understood from listening to Chris Adler and some of the other members. And by the time mid 2000 comes along, we have Willie Adler join the band. And he was really lucky to get in when he did, according to Chris Adler, the drummer, because they had a bus and they had just been signed under Prosthetic Records. I don't know if anybody remembers Prosthetic Records back in the day, but they signed a pretty decent amount of bands. And fast forwarding to 2000, same time period, the first official Lamb of God album was released under Prosthetic Records, known as New American Gospel. And that's sort of when Lamb of God, that's basically when the real cohesive story of Lamb of God sort of begins. And the only reason I sort of gave you that backstory about Burn the Priest is because it's sort of an important chapter. I might have got some of the details wrong, so please forgive me. It's been a long day. But basically, Lamb of God is a continuation of what used to be Burn the Priest, minus a couple lineup changes, and Randy came onto the scene, onto the Burn the Priest scene or band somewhere along the late 90s, right? Or maybe he was there from the get-go. I think I've seen videos of Burn the Priest from the mid 90s, and Randy Blythe was there, so I'm not really sure where. Maybe some of the information I was gathering wasn't accurate, but so basically Lamb of God toured for 2 whole years on New American Gospel, right? They toured their asses off. Mostly small clubs, a couple festivals. And that's basically the story of New American Gospel. And if you actually listen to a New American Gospel, I would say the majority of the songs kind of sound similar. They're all kind of in the same style, but they do have some really, really slow, sludgy parts. But also, they also introduce these really, really heavy, upbeat thrash metal parts. And basically, this is sort of, leads me off into another train of thought, but the whole originality of music, it's kind of like Charles Bukowski says, originality suffers from mass communication, right? And I think Lamb of God is a perfect example of before the age of real large-scale mass communication. And that's what makes Lamb of God so interesting, is because they basically started from nothing and they became one of the biggest heavy metal bands, in the heavy metal world. And if you actually listen to their first album, they were inventing a whole new style of this really sludgy, slightly groovy, really heavy, shocking, obnoxious, Pantera, almost death metal-esque sort of hardcore metal. And the proof is in the pudding, but if you listen to their first couple albums, you can really understand how original Lamb of God was, and that sort of goes back to our original point of what made Lamb of God so shocking. And I do have to say that part of that is because they were so damn original. Nobody really, really sounded like Lamb of God. Of course, you had a lot of hardcore bands that they were influenced by, and of course you had the thrash metal thing, but Lamb of God was somewhere nudged in between. They're almost more hardcore and grindcore and maybe punk. I keep forgetting to talk about their punk influences, but they're more hardcore and punk than they actually are thrash. But because of Willie Adler and Chris Adler and some of the, maybe John Campbell, they had a real heavy influence that sort of lended itself really well to maybe Mark Morton's alternative punk sort of guitar playing, as well as Randy Blythe's sort of vision for sort of the hardcore style that he sort of exhibited on his vocals. So anyway, fast forwarding to past, we've already talked about New American Gospel. You guys should go check out the album. It's pretty shocking. It's pretty heavy. I wouldn't say that it has a whole lot of diversity compared to their other albums, but in terms of, like I said, they were trying to find their style, so I'm not going to fault them for that. So after a long 2 years of touring, Lamb of God released their second album, As the Palaces Burn, in 2003. Now, basically, I think Metal Hammer, or one of those magazines or companies, basically stated that As the Palaces Burn was basically one of the best heavy metal albums ever, and I think that pretty much stands true to this day. If you guys haven't heard As the Palaces Burn, but Lamb of God, you definitely should. And that basically introduces what Lamb of God was to become and what Lamb of God was at that time. They were sort of breaking away from that real sludgy, hardcore, simplistic, maybe sort of really guttural vocals into more of their songs had more storytelling behind it. They had a little more melody. They were still really heavy and just really raunchy sounding guitars, really fast drums on Chris Adler. And just overall, that album is just, it's one of the best sort of metal out. And I sort of hesitate to say thrash metal or speed metal, or because Lamb of God is kind of somewhere in between. Lamb of God is very difficult sort of to describe. You know, they're considered sort of a thrash metal band, right, or a speed metal band, but they're really sort of their own thing, and they sort of have a lot of different influences. So, after 2003, they sort of, you know, they continued to play songs from, obviously, from As the Palaces Burn and New American Gospel, and they actually released a DVD called Terror and Hubris. And this is sort of maybe when they started to, very similar to Nightwish, I will add, they started to document the behind-the-scenes drama. And I do believe that it's the Terror and Hubris documentary. I want to say that's right, because they've had two documentaries called As the Palaces Burn, which is really confusing, and they had another documentary called Walk With Me in Hell, and then they obviously had the big documentary called Philadelphia, and then they had another documentary. They've had several different documentaries, but I believe the one that I'm referring to is the one. This was not Philadelphia where they were fighting on the tour bus, but Terror and Hubris sort of documented some of the behind-the-scenes footage / drama of Lamb of God. There's some footage of Willie Adler shitting his pants on the tour bus, and they just happened to maybe be, this was a couple years later when they actually made the DVD where I'm going to discuss this, but they happened to be sort of maybe driving by what they thought was the location of Willie Adler's shit poopy pants, and they called it the Blair Shit Project, and they went hunting out in the woods for Willie's drunken shit pants, and they found him, and Randy Blythe had him on a stick, and he basically said, you know, F you, Willie, don't crap your pants on the tour bus ever again. And so we sort of get this image of what Lamb of God was kind of going for. Obviously, they're not taking themselves too seriously, right? They're, you know, riding around in a van trying to find, you know, soiled jeans of Willie Adler from bygone tour dates and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of degeneracy that sort of comes into the scene with Lamb of God that we will sort of just unpack. Their DVDs tend to be a little bit degenerate, in my opinion. They haven't always stayed classy. You know, Randy Blythe was a raging drunk for many years. I don't think he was drunk every day or anything like that, but he was maybe kind of a binge drinker. He liked to drink his beer, kind of like I do, so I shouldn't talk shit. But there's a little bit of maybe unprofessionalism, I guess you could say, but that's what bands do. When they get to a certain point, they start filming all their goofy, you know, escapades as well as their behind-the-scenes drama. And sometimes it makes for interesting content. Sometimes we could have done without it, maybe like the Blair Willie Poop Project. But anyway, that sort of spells out the trajectory of As the Palaces Burn. It's a great album. It's probably the Lamb of God album that I go back to the most because it's kind of nudged in between New American Gospel and Ashes of the Wake. And Ashes of the Wake is a really, really good album, but it's a little more polished, it's a little more commercial perhaps, and it's not quite as, you know, harsh and just slamming as the Palaces Burn. But as the Palaces Burn is a little easier to listen to. The songs are better than they were on New American Gospel, right? So hopefully you guys can kind of relate to that. So by 2004, Ashes of the Wake is released, and basically that album met Lamb of God with enormous success. They started touring. They did the Sounds of the Underground tour. You know, they sort of went from these small clubs, and they sort of were sort of casted into the realm of, you know, the sort of that came later when they were casted into the realm of you know, arena shows. That sort of came later with Sacrament, but even with Ashes of the Wake, those first years from 2004 to the time, oh God, what's the name of the album? I'm having a huge Sacrament, having a huge brain delay here. But by the time from the, I guess I should say, from the time Ashes of the Wake came out to the time Sacrament came out, they started to sort of progress in their, not only their sound, we'll talk a little bit about that, but they progressed in their trajectory of how large their audience was. They went from these small clubs that we kind of see in Philadelphia, and that goes to the next part of our notes here. Ashes of the Wake was released with immense success, obviously, and sort of maybe slightly after Ashes of the Wake, they basically documented a tour documentary known as Philadelphia. Most Lamb of God fans have seen this. There's a lot of degeneracy on this, a lot of goofing around, and a lot of inter-band turmoil. You know, you can sort of see it happen from the beginning, where there's tension between Randy Bly and Chris Adler, as well as Mark Morton. That's sort of where the tension, it's this toxic trio that's sort of, and sort of the drama is stems from different things in that documentary, and we sort of understand the world, the world of drama that is Lamb of God. You know, it's a very complicated band to be in. Chris Adler is kind of like the leader, right? He's sort of like the leader drummer. He wants to make sure they're all putting on a good show. There's a couple scenes where Randy is just not really performing his best, and Chris Adler sort of says, well, let's get ourselves together. I personally would not put myself in a position to perform badly. And Randy Bly barks back at him and says, that's because you're a geek, you're a effing nerd, you don't know how to live your life and all this. So there's some tension between, obviously, Chris Adler and Randy Bly, but there's also tension between Mark Morton and Randy Bly, which comes to a head on the tour bus. I think it happened in Glasgow. Randy Bly, they played a couple shows somewhere. Might have been in Glasgow, but by the time they got to Glasgow, somebody had gifted them like a really, really strong bottle of alcohol. I think maybe it was scotch or something. I can't remember. But they're driving along, or maybe they're parked somewhere out in Glasgow, and Randy Bly starts kind of abusing Chris Adler, verbally abusing him, and Randy Bly is in a kilt. Things are getting kind of wacky, and he wants to go out drinking and all this kind of stuff. And then he gets furious because he feels like people are patronizing him, right? And nobody really knows for sure what took place on the Philadelphia fight. I think the majority of it was just drunken nuisance and built up resentments from touring. We talked about that in the Nightwish video. Touring is not really fun, like the fans sort of, or up and coming musicians sort of perceive it to be. Touring is actually a very, very draining process, and I've actually never really toured, but I got pretty close to it, and I was playing almost every other night for a couple summers and a couple years. Over the years, I've probably played at least 60 or 70 shows. Not recently. This was way back in the early, maybe from 2005 to, I kind of stopped performing in 2014 or 15, but I played a lot of live concerts. I did a lot of driving, I did a lot of promoting and stuff, so I kind of know what that's like. I wasn't on a full-blown tour, thank God, because I probably would have not been able to make it. But Lamb of God is willing to show you those struggles So basically, make a long story short, Randy Bly basically says, let's just have a fist fight here on the streets of Glasgow. I'm going to beat all your asses and all this kind of stuff. I'm kind of paraphrasing, I'm not trying to put words in any of the members' mouth, but there was an incident and Mark Morton basically got really fed up with Randy Bly and he kind of shoved him or punched him or something. And then it just spiraled out of control. And sort of by the end of that sequence, Randy Bly and Mark Morton are outside of the tour bus, basically just beating the crap out of each other. It didn't really look like they were really trying to hurt each other, but there was some pent up anger there. Randy Bly like broke his nose, and Mark Morton actually fractured his shoulder or something like that, sprained his shoulder. I think they had to play a couple shows without Mark Morton. So really, I mean, what band is going to give you that other than Lamb of God, right? And it was all real and all this stuff. So fast forwarding to 2006, we have the Sacrament album. I think most young people my age that were metalheads, everybody came across the Sacrament album. Maybe you saw a poster, maybe you saw it in the metal magazines. Even if you didn't listen to it, you probably heard Redneck or maybe Walk With Me in Hell. And I will say that Sacrament definitely took them out of the age of that really primitive deathened hardcore kind of sound. And I believe they worked with Josh Wilbur, a gentleman named Josh Wilbur that they worked with previously on Ashes of the Wake. Now, we sort of skipped over Ashes of the Wake, but Ashes of the Wake was basically probably, in terms of sound and quality, the best Lamb of God album in that time period, right? It was better sounding than gospel, obviously. It was better sounding, better recorded than As the Palaces Burn, and everything sounded really nice. You could hear all the instruments, and they had a little bit more melody. They had interesting sort of voiceovers by Randy Bly, where he goes, if there was a single day I could live, I'd trade all the others away. He does these really interesting voiceovers, and then he goes into the really heavy stuff, which he sort of did before, but not quite as well as he did on Ashes of the Wake. It was a heavy album, but it was a little more melodic. It was a little more well produced. And the album kind of fizzles out maybe after the 6th or 7th song, in my opinion. I mean, I've listened to it quite a few times, but it's a really strong album. I mean, we had You've Got Something to Die For. We had Laid to Rest. We had Hourglass. It's just packed full of good songs. Even, what's that other song they had? Blood of the Scribe is a pretty cool song, which they actually don't even play live. But what's interesting about Lamb of God, they actually have a song called Remorses for the Dead, which I think is on Ashes of the Wake. And they have another song called, I can't even remember it right now. Let me just check this real quick. Okay, so yeah, Remorses for the Dead is from, like I said, from Ashes of the Wake, but the intro to Remorses for the Dead is almost like a sequel to another song that they had on As the Palaces Burn, and I just can't think of it right now. We're going to look up the track list because Lamb of God does this really, really interesting sort of... Okay, so it's called Vigil. So, and the reason this triggered my memory is because they sort of have this little, so this song is called, so Remorse for the Dead has this really, really opening melodic intro. It's not acoustic per se, but it's really, really melodic, and it's almost a sequel to Vigil from As the Palaces Burn. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, that really, really melodic. So everybody knows what I'm talking about. And then Vigil is interesting too. It's more like so they have these really, really interesting little tiny breaks from all the really hardcore heavy music that they make, and they actually brilliantly sort of included in the, sort of the, some of the scenes, some of the dramatic, violent scenes from Philadelphia. They included some of these intros into their film trajectory, which really worked really well. And I think it definitely had an impact on a lot of other heavy metal bands and maybe just up and coming bands as a whole. You know, everybody sort of wanted to have that dramatic, not necessarily acoustic, but sort of laid back part of their music that they could relate to something crazy that was going on in the band or whatever, right? So I'm kind of going off into a tangent there. But this goes back to, we're fast forwarding to roughly around 2006, I believe, where Sacrament was released. And all throughout 2004, 2005, I was listening to a lot of different bands, but I didn't really heavily, officially get into Lamb of God until roughly 2006. I want to say Sacrament was released in 2006. Sacrament, Lamb of God. Okay, so we were right about that. Sacrament came out in 2006. And like I said, this is not the current, this is not the original lineup. This is a man by the name of Art Cruz. I believe he was from a band called, I forgot the name of his band, so I don't want to say that. But he's their new drummer, Art Cruz. Maybe we should pull up a picture of Chris Adler here, but you guys got to see him in the beginning. But anyway, we're going back to 2006 here. Chris Adler hasn't left the band yet, thank God. So Sacrament is released, and that basically took Lamb of God to a whole nother level of success, and a whole nother level of fame. They toured with Slayer again and again. They actually got a tour with Metallica a couple of years after that. And like I said, when I saw Lamb of God play, they played a couple songs. I've seen Lamb of God twice, about a year, 2 years apart, roughly, maybe a year and a half. But when I saw them on the Unholy Alliance tour, Randy Blythe had shaved his head, and he was like drinking Jack Daniels, and somebody threw a beer at Whitley Adler, and Whitley Adler was just like this, and then he stopped all of a sudden, and he was like, and it was just a really awesome, epic show. I'm not sure what this little reconnector device is here. So let me just make sure this is still recording. It looks like we're still recording here. So it was just a really raunchy heavy metal show. There were some crazy Nazis, you know, trying to start fights in the mosh pit and stuff. And I just remember how intense Lamb of God was. I almost couldn't even hear anything because I was like right up in front of the stage. And Lamb of God was still kind of small at that time because you could tell like the majority of people were there. They would leave in between bands, and maybe there was more people than I remember for Lamb of God, but I think they had to work to really get the crowd going, because everybody was basically sitting around like this, waiting for Slayer, right? Not knowing that what they were witnessing with Lamb of God was almost more important, you know, or more interesting perhaps than what they were actually going to get from Slayer later. Slayer, of course, did put on a really, really good show. But anyway, so Sacrament came out, and I did notice that Sacrament was even more produced than Ashes of the Wake, and I didn't quite like it as much. Some of the vocal patterns that Randy Blythe was doing on Sacrament were a little corny, I think. And I think a lot of that had to do with Josh Wilbur. He overproduced that fucking album, in my opinion. There's too many effects. There's too many layering. There's too many, like, you know, some of the songs they could have ended 2 or 3 minutes earlier. But Josh Wilbur sort of wanted them to have this, you know, chorus effect with some of their songs, and just some of the vocal patterns on that album, they make me cringe. I don't know what Lamb of God was thinking, but I think they were just trying to collaborate with another producer, just trying to do something different, trying to top their last album. And it does have some pretty technical songs, but as a whole, it's not as heavy, it's not as raunchy, it's not the traditional really heavy Lamb of God that we knew from Ashes of the Wake or As the Palaces Burn. So that's kind of Wrath in a nutshell, and I saw them again on their 2007 tour in Rochester, New York. They played with Gojira, and they played with Who else did they play with? I think Lamb of God was headlining that. There were a couple of other, I think it was Machine Head, Lamb of God, Gojira, and a couple other acts. Behemoth, maybe? I don't remember. I don't think it was Behemoth. Um, but that was sort of a one-off tour where they were doing small clubs, and that was really cool. And they sounded great. I mean, that was a great performance. But you did have some weird songs from Sacrament, like Descending, you know, just some weird stuff that Mark Morton wrote. Really cool songs, but a little more like a grungy alternative blues kind of feel that maybe didn't 100% fit into Lamb of God. And Lamb of God does, even with their heavy songs, there's an edge of sort of grungy blues, I guess you could say, that Mark Morton kind of brings to the table. But I think Mark Morton's songs on their own that he writes as a whole are maybe better suited for a side project or something. But having said that, you know, he does write really cool intros, like some of the intro in we're fast forwarding to the Wrath album from 2009. Wrath was released, but in between the Sacrament album and the Wrath album, they actually released a really cool DVD called Walk With Me in Hell, and you could tell all the members were kind of getting jaded. The content was just not quite as good, and they started to delve into sort of degeneracy once again. And they actually had a stripper come on their tour bus and clean the tour bus. I don't know what the purpose of that was, if it was staged or what even the purpose of filming that was. It was just kind of not very tasteful, but what are you going to do? Lamb of God. They were probably all drunk, and they thought, oh, this will be funny. Let's have a stripper, you know, go on the tour bus and whatever. You know, Lamb of God does some really, really stupid things. And they also had Randy Blythe sort of berating before the concert. He would like bring people on stage from other bands or like that worked for I don't even know who they were, but he would like bring people on the stage and kind of verbally abuse them. Definitely does not paint Lamb of God in the best light. And I think that's sort of what we talk about with the drama of Lamb of God. Like we could have done without all of that crap. You know, I think their music was good enough on its own without all this extraneous, you know, extra bull crap that we had to deal with, whether it was the fighting or, you know, burning the porn videos on the Philadelphia DVD, which was, you know, kind of an interesting concept, but I don't think they were really burning the porn videos. Somebody had gifted them like a bunch of porn DVDs or something, and John Campbell was like, we're not really going to watch these porn videos. We're actually just going to throw them in a fire and watch them burn or some bullshit. And then they had just all kinds of weird degenerate shit that we could have done without. And by the time we got to the Walk With Me in Hell DVD, they were just doing all silly things, like Willie was walking around with a big mask and everybody was punching him. He had like this big fucking chicken mask or some bullshit, and everybody was just punching him in the face. And then Randy Blythe was abusing people on stage, and just all this just stuff we did not really need in the Lamb of God video, but for some reason they put it in. When you're young and you're in the zone and you're stupid, those are the kind of things you do. So they had that DVD, which is kind of interesting, but I wouldn't say it's their best DVD. And, you know, Chris Adler talks about how, you know, Lamb of God is no longer this you know, sort of underground heavy metal offshoot that everybody's rooting for. You know, Lamb of God was the target. And Lamb of God seems to have this complex that they're set up to fail all the time, that everybody's out to get them. There's a black cloud under Lamb of God. And I do think there's some dark, really, really bad, dark energy in Lamb of God. I know that Randy Blythe, as well as Mark Morton, suffered the loss of their children, really young children, which is pretty tragic. Maybe that's kind of what fucked up Lamb of God. I don't really know. Maybe it was Randy Blythe's alcoholism. Maybe it was drug use or alcoholism from some collectively as a band. But this is sort of where Randy Blythe sort of starts to descend into his really, really heavy drinking stage. And this is actually all documented in his biography called Dark Days. It's more like a memoir, right? But it's all documented in Dark Days when but I don't want to give away the content of the book because I want you guys to read it for yourselves. We'll talk a little bit about Dark Days in the future, but basically what I'm saying is if you want to get a really good perspective of some of the problems in Lamb of God, you might want to read Dark Days by Randy Bly. So I talked about how we saw him in Rochester and all that stuff. So they released the documentary. And by the time 2009 comes around, I remember it was my first year of college, and my ex-girlfriend in college, the second semester of college, I started telling her what kind of music I liked and stuff. She actually bought me the first copy of Wrath on CD that I ever had, which was really cool. All kinds of obnoxious ads coming over here. So that was really cool, and Wrath was kind of like a little bit of a return to Ashes of the Wake, and it wasn't quite like as raunchy as the Palaces Burn or New American Gospel, but it was kind of like a cross between Sacrament and Ashes of the Wake. And Chris Adler even brought back some of the blast beats, which was really cool. Some of the opening songs and some of the other songs have blast beats. And overall, it was a much more solid, cohesive, heavy, raunchy Lamb of God album than Sacrament was, in my opinion. So I would say that Wrath was kind of maybe the return of the Lamb of God that we were kind of hoping for on Sacrament that we didn't quite get, right? Let me know if you in the comments if you guys relate to that. So okay. So fast forwarding to roughly around 2011, Lamb of God released their new album called Resolution. So going from 2009, 2010, they're very consistent with albums. They're not like Nightwish where you have to wait 3 and 4 years sometimes to get an album. Lamb of God usually, if all is well and good in the Lamb of God camp, they will release an album at least every year or two, every 2 or 3 years, no longer than that, which is really great. So I would say this is after Wrath came out, I sort of kind of drifted away from Lamb of God. I guess because at that time I was delving more into the world of extreme metal. I was getting into, stuff like Nile and Cannibal Corpse and Dying Fetus and Suffocation. And, I was even getting into more black metal at the time, stuff like Immortal, Dark Throne, Watain, Behemoth. And I kind of lost interest in the American stuff because it had sort of started to become stagnant for me. And I think Lamb of God had sort of become stagnant. And I'm not saying that that they weren't good. I just think Lamb of God has always stayed to Lamb of God, right? Which is really great. They've never come out with really a one-off album or anything that's really been extremely different or extremely disappointing. So I do think that's a really great trait to have in a band that you can depend on to come up with the same sort of vibe, right, that you're used to. Having said that, they've never really done anything different per se. I mean, they have in small elements, but they haven't really done anything. And this will probably hurt them. They're kind of like the Cannibal Corpse of thrash metal, I guess you could say. They never stray from what they do, and each time they do it, they get heavier and better at it. So you can't fault them for that. But I guess you can only listen to so much Lamb of God, right, before you want to listen to some Nightwish or some Iron Maiden or something a little bit more melodic, maybe a little bit more, less intense. Lamb of God has its time, and there's certain days of the week where you want to rage Lamb of God all day long. Don't get me wrong, but they don't necessarily make for a very profound necessarily listening experience. I mean, their music sort of keeps you in sort of the aggressive state. They do have a lot of transcendent philosophical themes and concepts behind their music too. So I'm not trying to denigrate that on any level, but their music is just very aggressive. It's almost like when you turn on Slayer, but Slayer is actually, we'll make a video about Slayer later on, but Lamb of God is actually a step above Slayer in terms of their lyrical content, we'll talk about that later. So roughly around 2011, we saw the release of Resolution, where I sort of, drifted away from Lamb of God. I actually went back recently and listened to the Resolution album, and it was actually really, really solid. I had heard a couple of the tracks initially when it first came out on some compilation tapes or compilation albums and CDs and stuff that my friends had. But I was kind of, at that time specifically, I was just kind of bored with Lamb of God. I was like, all right, well, let's get into something a little more European, a little more heavy. But I've always enjoyed Lamb of God. I've always kind of kept them in the peripheral, right? So we talked about that. So, and I wrote in my notes here, this is where we start talking about the pre-lawsuit, murder trial of Randy Bly, or manslaughter trial, I will say. So I believe this was actually before Resolutions came out, but somewhere roughly around 2010, this is when things get really, really dark for Lamb of God. And I will talk a little bit about this, maybe in this video, or this might even require a separate video. I just really hope this video is recording, because we just lost power a couple of hours ago, actually. But Lamb of God played a show in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and there was basically a fan by the name of Daniel Nosek, and there was a couple different, he wasn't the only person that was sort of being a nuisance. There was a couple other fans, but he was sort of jumping on stage and sort of causing a havoc to Lamb of God on stage. And Lamb, I remember when I read the Dark Days memoir, the minute they showed up to this particular venue in Prague, like they knew something was not right, because the security was really bad and the stage was really, really small. It was not a very good venue to hold a big band like Lamb of God, right? So this young gentleman by the name of Daniel Nosek was kind of jumping up on stage, just having a great time, but he was kind of just getting a little too close to the band. He was interfering with the live show. And Randy Bly discussed in his memoir, I'm not sure if Daniel Nosek is the exact guy that he did this to. I would assume it was. But after a while, Daniel Nosek was just kind of bumping into Randy Bly, kind of getting in his face, getting in his personal space, getting in some of the other band members' personal space. So at some point, Randy Bly somehow pinned him to the ground and just was kind of holding him on the ground, just screaming into the microphone saying, "Don't do this again, or I'm not gonna let you off the floor." He wasn't hurting him, right? But he was kind of getting really, really pissed off. And if you ever played live, like, you don't want people on stage, number one, because it's not safe, but number two, it's because it's a nuisance. Like, having 4 or 5 band members on stage, that's a nuisance enough. You don't need like crazy fans jumping around causing issues on top of it. So anyway, somewhere along the line, Randy Bly kind of went like this or something. And the kid was probably already kind of running off the stage, right? But Randy Bly kind of just went like this or went like this, kind of helped nudge him off the stage, right? He didn't really like body slam him off the stage or anything. But anyway, something went wrong. Nobody knows if this individual, Daniel Nosek, actually fell off the stage, or if maybe somebody knocked Daniel Nosek over afterwards, maybe some time after he was already off the stage. But allegedly, Daniel Nosek suffered a concussion, and I guess he was still walking around for a couple days, or maybe a week or something after this concert in the Czech Republic. But evidently, at some point, obviously, Daniel Nosek passed away, which was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And there's some footage of what allegedly took place. There's really no evidence that Randy Bly caused any wrongdoing or any manslaughter or anything like that. Metal shows are really chaotic, and there's no lights. You can't really see what's going on. So, it was a complicated trial. But basically, before I start talking about the trial, this show happened in 2010. And the band left the venue. Nobody knew anything. The kid was allegedly, I think, walking around, or maybe he was hospitalized a couple days after the show. So there was no, according to my research and what I read in Randy Bly's book, there was no actual injury that was visible at the actual show in Prague. So the band just went about their way, right? But make a long story short, let's see here. Still on support of the Resolutions tour, I believe, in June of 2012, when Lamb of God, this is what, 2 years later now, I want to say. Yeah, 2 years later, Lamb of God, roughly 2 years, Lamb of God returned back to the Czech Republic, having no knowledge, right, that Daniel Nosek had passed away under the influence of the Lamb of God concert, right? So I'm not sure exactly. Like, I could go grab my book of Dark Days by Randy Bly, but I think I can sum it up pretty well. They arrived at the airport somewhere around in the Czech Republic or around Prague or something like that, where this fan was allegedly, died after the Lamb of God concert. I don't believe he died at the actual concert, but he died a couple days later, maybe a week later, or something to that effect. Don't quote me on that. Terrible tragedy either way, though. Like, it's terrible. But basically, they were getting off. Lamb of God was ready to play another show in Prague. They had no idea what had taken place a couple of years prior to that, right? So they start getting off the plane, and all of a sudden, when they're walking off the runway, whatever, walking off that little tube space, after you get off the plane, they're heading towards wherever. All of a sudden, there's like SWAT team members, and some of the airport officials like kind of say, "Well, are you Randy Bly?" Or I think they actually pulled the whole band aside at first, or something like that, and nobody really knew what was going on. But Randy Bly was kind of singled out, and he was taken into a glass room, I believe, and pretty shocking stuff. Just a really crazy story, like, that you don't wish on anybody. But we'll talk a little bit about what I think happened spiritually to Lamb of God. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Make a note to remind myself before I forget, before I interrupt myself like I constantly do. But Randy Bly was signaled out. They handed in the paperwork basically saying that you, Randy Bly, are accused or suspected of involuntary manslaughter in the Czech Republic, in Prague, due to a fan that died after you pushed him off the stage, or something to that effect. I don't know what it actually said in the initial report, but they basically hauled Randy off to the city jail in the Czech Republic, and he was later transferred to Pankrak, which is a horrible, horrible jail in the Czech Republic. But, you guys can read the Randy Bly Dark Days memoir for more information on that. I don't want to get too far into that because it's just a whole nother tale to be told. We can make a whole nother video about that. But from the time he was in custody, maybe at the city jail, to the time he was in Pankrak, he actually only served about 38 days in prison / city jail, or wherever the hell he was. But it was a terrible tragedy for Lamb of God, and they actually made a documentary called Walk With Me in Hell. And no, it's not Walk With Me in Hell. It's called As the Palaces Burn, I think. Right? But there's actually another documentary that they released at some point called As the Palaces Burn, which is more like an album documentary. But As the Palaces Burn, this documentary, I think that's what it's called, right? Yeah, it's called As the Palaces Burn, and it's like the documentary actually originally started. It's actually a great documentary, probably the best Lamb of God documentary, because there's no degeneracy, there's no bullshit. It's just them owning up to kind of what happened to Lamb of God. And this is still when Chris Adler was in the band, right? But the documentary sort of starts out with their international fans basically talking about how Lamb of God has helped them through a lot of different problems in their life, what they like about Lamb of God, all that interesting stuff. But somewhere along the line, while they were filming, Randy got arrested, right? So they had to start auctioning off all their equipment, and They didn't know whether they were going to see Randy Bly again. Nobody, it's all documented in the book, Dark Days by Randy Bly. It's the best rock and roll, I wouldn't even call it a rock and roll memoir, but it's the best memoir written by a musician that you'll ever read. It's better than any Slash book or any Van Halen book or any Aerosmith book or the Randy Bly memoir is hands down the best musician memoir that I've ever read, because it's not a bunch of egotistical nonsense. It's a really, really good book about not only Randy Bly but about Lamb of God too, and about the grief that he suffered through, and he really took ownership of the loss of that fan. And he actually, when he was able to get sort of, he was on, I don't want to say bond, but I'm not a expert on legal terminology, but he was released on recognizance, I guess you could say, and he was allowed to come all the way back to the United States. They had good lawyers and all that stuff. I don't want to get into that, but they had really good lawyers and a good record label and really, really good fan support. And he could have never returned. And a lot of his constituents were basically saying, Randy, please don't go back to the Czech Republic. It's a foreign country. You don't know. They're trying to put you in prison, blah, blah, blah. But Randy Bly said, because one of my fans died at my concert, I can't walk away from this. I have to return back. And that's what he did. He returned, and he turned. Randy Bly really kind of turned himself around, in a lot of ways. And that's part of the story of Lamb of God. And before I interrupt myself, I will say that the fan dying at one of Lamb of God's concerts, obviously it wasn't the fault of Lamb of God or Randy Bly. Nobody intended for anybody to die. But I do think there's a level of karma that comes into play with not only the type of music that Lamb of God plays, but even in the old days when Lamb of God, I think sometimes they still do it, but they do this thing called the Wall of Death, where they separate all their fans and the crowd, and then they just run full speed and just tackle each other, or just beat the crap out of you. Nobody's really purposely trying to beat each other up, but even if you just watch some of the Lamb of God concerts, at least in the early days, in the demeanor of Randy Bly, there is, maybe in the demeanor of the whole band as a whole, there's a level of hostility, and there's a level of I don't even know how you would describe it, but it's kind of like what happened to Pantera. Pantera was kind of a toxic band. And it's a tragedy that we lost, Dimebag in the way that we did. But I think if you're, and that's the whole, I get kind of emotional about this, because heavy metal does not have to be this toxic, low energy, low astral kind of thing, right? Heavy metal can be like Nightwish, or heavy metal can be like NC or heavy metal can be like Iron Maiden or Metallica or whatever. But I think Lamb of God and bands like Lamb of God and Pantera and bands like that, they sort of defaulted into this, maybe projecting this negative energy, in the case of Dimebag perhaps, that the fans kind of knew. They knew that there was some toxicity going on in Pantera, right? And obviously the guy that shot Dimebag was, evil, and he was crazy, and he was unhinged. But there's a level of what you project as a band that, in one way or another, comes back to you, right? And I'm not saying that Lamb of God is maybe as toxic as Pantera, because Phil Anselmo and all that stuff, that's a whole nother topic. But I will say that there was a level of toxic hostility. I think Lamb of God probably had a lot of fans that were hurt at their concerts way before Daniel, Nosek, I think his name is. Just want to make sure I get his name right. Daniel Nosek. Yeah, I mean, way before Daniel Nosek died, I'm sure there was. I mean, supposedly there were some lawsuits that were coming at Lamb of God from the fact that they kept doing the Wall of Death. And I think that's the kind of thing that keeps people away from listening to heavy metal is this low astral violence that we see in the metal scene. And I'm not saying it's like full blown malevolent violence, right? But I'm saying that it defaults itself into, like, we could even go into the realm of Motley Crue. You know, why did Vince Neil lose his daughter of cancer when she was like 6 years old? Well, it sucks, but I do think it's a result of karma that was built up in Vince Neil and in Motley Crue. You know, why is Motley Crue so effed up is because they have a lot of really bad karma. You know, the things that Vince Neil has done in his life, not only to women, but just to people in general, you know, somehow that came back to bite him in the ass with killing his daughter of cancer. You know, and I know some of the members of Lamb of God lost their children too, and hopefully that all happened before they had projected all this negative energy into the universe. But I can't help but think that maybe that, or maybe even just you know, things happen. But I think the whole thing with Daniel Nosek, it just kind of reminded me of what happened with the whole Pantera thing. I think things that you do as a band, the way that you represent yourself, the energy that you put out there, you know, how you conduct yourself on stage, what you say on stage, what you tell your fans to do on stage, all of that, you know, it manifests itself somehow. And maybe somehow the stars were just not aligned in Lamb of God's favor that night. It's like they always say, Lamb of God always had a black cloud over their head. Well, you know, obviously they did, because they lost a fan. And I don't think it was because of Randy Bly or because of Lamb of God, but I think it's maybe perhaps it was a test. God, or maybe the universe, had to put Randy Bly through that test to teach him a lesson. Now, I don't know how much they've learned from that. Their shows still seem pretty crazy. Hopefully they're not still doing the Wall of Death and all that stuff, but you know, I would assume that fans have been hurt at metal shows way before Daniel Nosek, but even fans have died at concerts even before that particular show. But I guess the Czech Republic was just not, you know, a particular place to. That was a terrible tragedy for that to happen, and I think there's just a lot of. Let me know if you guys relate to that. Do you guys think negativity within bands, you know, comes back in the form of karma to sort of put people in their place, or show people the right way, or show people the wrong way and stuff like that? And I think Randy Bly learned a lot from that. So that was a really, really dark time for Lamb of God, obviously. That was during the Resolutions tour.